The room went dead silent when the monitors started their collective hum. Katie Rodriguez had 3 minutes to decide if she was going to stay invisible or let someone die. She didn't know it yet. Nobody in Oak Creek Memorial knew it yet. Not the 15 specialists signed onto Marcus Webb's case. Not Dr. Sterling with his practice smile and his tablet full of billing codes. Not Sergeant Major David Webb, sitting rigid in the visitor's chair like a man who'd already lost everything that mattered. What they didn't know was that the quiet nurse in the corner, the one who kept her head down and made no noise during rounds, was going to end careers before the sun set. They didn't know she'd already pulled a 7-year-old boy from a collapsed building in Kandahar, that those hands pushing the 4-line into Marcus Webb's arm had held lives together in places that officially didn't exist on any map. The pediatric ICU at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like antiseptic and something else underneath, floor wax, maybe, or the particular staleness of air conditioning that hadn't tasted fresh oxygen in months. Katie moved through the unit with a kind of invisible competence that made other nurses look twice, then shrug, then forget she'd been there at all. Her left hand trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching, a souvenir from shrapnel that officially never happened, from an operation that was erased from every record the moment her team crossed the border back into Pakistan. 20 years of silence. 20 years of keeping her hand steady when her mind was somewhere else entirely. She kept a pair of worn combat boots in her locker. The leather was creased at the ankles, the soles worn thin enough that you could see the stitching if you looked close. She told the curious nurses they belonged to her late husband. Half-truth. The kind of lie that protected classified reality, that kept her son's name out of witness protection files, that paid for her invisibility with her identity. No one asked questions about combat boots. No one asked about the way she moved like someone who'd learned medicine in triage tents instead of classrooms. The assignment came at shift change. 7:30, room for 12. 12-year-old. Diving accident. Complete cervical spinal cord injury. She pushed the button on the automatic doors and stepped into the room before she could think about stepping back out. Marcus Webb was small for his age. Tanned skin from a life before the hospital, before the diving accident that took everything from his neck down. His eyes moved, they always moved first, the last thing to go in a spinal injury, tracking her as she entered. Scared. Every 12-year-old in a pediatric ICU was scared, but Marcus's fear had a specific gravity to it, the weight of knowing exactly what he'd lost. The father stood when she approached. Sergeant Major David Webb. The name was on the chart. The bearing was unmistakable, a Marine. Even sitting in a hospital visitor's chair, he held himself with the kind of rigid discipline that only came from decades of carrying the weight of other people's lives. His hands were scarred. His eyes were the color of storm clouds over the Atlantic. She'd seen men like this before. She'd served alongside men like this. She knew the specific kind of helplessness that came when a warrior couldn't fight his way out of the situation in front of him. And then she looked at Marcus's face. Really looked. 20 years collapsed into a single moment. She was in Kandahar again, in the smoke from a building that had been hit 30 seconds ago, moving through rubble with her hands out and her breath coming in controlled measures. The infant, because that's what he'd been then, maybe 7 years old, small enough to carry with one arm while she moved through the wreckage, had his eyes open. Terrified. The exact same brown. The exact same shape around them. The exact same way he looked at her, like she was the only person in the world who could possibly understand what had just happened. Katie's hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She'd learned not to show the seams where the past broke through into the present. She introduced herself to Sergeant Major Webb with the precise deferential tone of a military nurse addressing a superior officer, kept her eyes on the monitors instead of the boy, and started the assessment with the kind of clinical efficiency that left no room for recognition or memory or the specific gravity of what it meant that the child she'd pulled from that collapsed building was now lying in a hospital bed in Houston with a spinal cord that would never move again. "I'm going to be his primary care nurse," she said. "I've got 15 years of pediatric ICU experience." Sergeant Major Webb nodded once. "Sharp. Military. Appreciate that." She didn't tell him she had 23 years of operational medical experience that would never go on a resume. She didn't tell him that she'd learned medicine from people who didn't have time to explain what they were doing. You watched, you learned, you moved your hands the same way the next time. She didn't tell him that the 7-year-old she'd pulled from their building in Kandahar had somehow become the 12-year-old in front of her now, and that the universe had a specific kind of cruelty she'd thought she was done paying for. The round started at 8:15. Dr. Sterling led the procession like a conductor moving through his orchestra, 15 specialists trailing behind him, all in white coats, all checking their watches like they had somewhere more important to be. Neurosurgery, neurorehabilitation, orthopedic spine, cardiology, 2 different radiologists, a physiatrist, a neuropsychologist, an intensivist. The parade of credentials was staggering. The parade of billing codes was staggering. The parade of expertise meant absolutely nothing if the conclusion at the end was already written. Katie stood back from the bed, never in the way, never in the sight line, never drawing attention. That was the technique. Make yourself useful enough that they needed you. Make yourself invisible enough that they forgot you were there. That was how you stayed safe when you had too many secrets to survive scrutiny. Dr. Sterling moved through the examination with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from doing the same procedure 300 times before breakfast. He checked the reflexes that weren't there. He tested the sensation that had evaporated. He nodded at each of his colleagues like they were confirming what he already knew. The boy would never move again. The boy would never feel anything below his neck. The boy would spend the rest of his life as a locked-in consciousness trapped in a body that could not respond. That was the conclusion. That was the diagnosis. That was the inevitable outcome, stated with the kind of certainty that only came from people who'd stopped looking for different answers a long time ago. But Dr. Sterling lingered when he reached the tablet. He pulled up the imaging. He swiped through the scans, the CT, the MRI, the 3-dimensional reconstruction of vertebrae and cord and the space between them. And then he pulled up the equipment catalog. The spinal stimulator was a beautiful piece of engineering. $40,000. The kind of equipment that insurance companies paid for because it looked like hope even when the statistics said it wasn't. Epidural electrode array. Pulse generator implanted subcutaneously. The promise of neural plasticity and recovery retraining and a future that existed only in the marketing materials and the commission structure the device company had set up with hospitals like Oak Creek Memorial. Katie watched his hands move. She watched the smile that crossed his face. She'd seen that expression before, not in hospitals. In forward operating bases. In the moment right before supplies got lost and the bribes started flowing. She knew corruption. She'd seen it operate in countries where nobody cared about oversight and in cities where the oversight had been paid off years ago. When rounds ended, she waited. The parade of specialists dispersed like water finding cracks. Dr. Sterling moved toward the nurse's station. She pulled up the chart on the computer terminal, not the same terminal, positioned so she could see the screen without being directly in his sight line. She opened the device company's invoice. She opened the ordering history. She opened the correspondence between Dr. Sterling's personal email and a rep named Michelle Reeves at Neurotech Solutions, dated 2 weeks ago. Her hands moved on their own. Muscle memory from a different life. Photography. The kind of careful documentation they trained her to do in case she ever needed to prove that something had happened. She took the images. The emails. The financial records. The invoice with the hospital letterhead and the doctor's authorization and the box where it said medically necessary when every person in this hospital knew that Marcus Webb would never benefit from anything this expensive. The boots in her locker felt heavier that afternoon. Worn leather. Creased at the ankles. Souvenirs from a life where the consequences of looking away were measured in the bodies left behind. She sat on the bench in the break room and pulled them out, turned them over in her hands, felt the weight of every decision that had led to standing in this hospital, assigned to this patient, watching this doctor set up a billing scheme that would drain a military insurance fund and leave a paralyzed child as collateral damage. She had two choices. Stay invisible. Let the system work. Let the 15 specialists continue their process of elimination until they all agreed on the only outcome they'd been pursuing from the beginning. Let the spinal stimulator be installed. Let the insurance pay. Let Dr. Sterling's commission hit his account like it was supposed to. Or she could speak. She could raise her hand. She could say the words that nobody wanted to hear from a quiet nurse with a 12-year-old patient and a borrowed authority she was never supposed to claim. The intercom crackled. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 2. She stood anyway, pulled on the boots like armor, and made the decision that would change everything. Morning rounds at Oak Creek Memorial moved like clockwork, Dr. Sterling leading his entourage of specialists down the corridor, white coats fluttering like wings, each one carrying a tablet displaying Marcus Webb's imaging studies. Katie stood at the foot of the boy's bed, her worn combat boots planted shoulder-width apart on the linoleum, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in the room settle on her like sediment. Sterling reviewed the chart aloud, his voice carrying the cadence of a man accustomed to being the loudest voice in every space he occupied. $40,000 spinal cord stimulator, he announced, gesturing toward his tablet. FDA approved for this exact pathology. Insurance approval already processed. Sergeant Major Webb sat rigid in the plastic chair beside his son's bed, shoulders squared as if taking incoming fire, watching the doctor's mouth move while his 12-year-old lay motionless beneath white sheets, the ventilator beside him hissing its mechanical rhythm. Katie stepped forward. Not aggressive. Not loud. Just present. Dr. Sterling, what's the clinical indication for device implantation given Marcus's complete transection at CR5? The room contracted. Sterling's face flashed crimson for 1 second before smoothing back into condescension like oil across water. When he spoke, his voice dropped into the registers of a man savoring his own intelligence. Ms. Rodriguez, it is Ms., correct, not doctor. Perhaps you'd like to share which of your extensive nursing courses covered advanced neurosurgical device selection. 3 of the 14 specialists chuckled, the sound like ice cracking under pressure. He continued without pause, his eyes never leaving her face. Or maybe Florence Nightingale here thinks her bedside manner trumps our combined 70 years of subspecialty training. The specialist beside him smiled. Someone in the hallway outside the room shifted weight, boots on tile echoing through the tension. Katie took one measured breath. Her jaw was iron. Her hands didn't shake. She let silence fill the space where an apology could have lived, and when she spoke, her voice came out steady as a metronome. 15 doctors cashing checks don't outweigh one person who actually looks at the patient. She paused. At the child. Sterling's face went very still. That's when she knew she'd won something and lost something else entirely. Sergeant Major Webb's eyes widened, then narrowed, calculating. He was looking at Katie differently now, the way a soldier looks at another soldier who's willing to stand in front of artillery fire without flinching. By afternoon, the unit board outside the main station bore Sterling's handwriting in red marker, the letters aggressive and precise, K. Rodriguez, disciplinary action, overstepping scope of practice, insubordination during rounds, undermining physician authority. The board hung in the main corridor where every staff member passed on their way to the supply closet, the bathroom, the break room. 7 nurses had already seen it by the time Katie clocked in for the evening shift. The break room at 11:24 a.m. was where the real reckoning happened. Katie pushed through the double doors with her lunch tray, a turkey sandwich on wheat, a bottle of water, an apple she didn't remember bringing but found herself carrying anyway. The room held 6 nurses, 2 respiratory therapists, and a nurse practitioner hunched over a laptop. Conversations mid-sentence. Laughter cut short. Then the scatter. It happened all at once, the way a school of fish parts when a shark enters the water. Chairs scraped backward. A respiratory therapist stood so quickly his stool fell sideways. One nurse muttered, "Gotta check on my patient," with zero conviction. Within 90 seconds, the break room held Katie and one nurse practitioner who stared with such aggressive focus at her laptop that the screen may as well have been the most critical document in medical history. Katie sat at the center table, the only open seat, and bit into her sandwich with measured precision. Each chew was deliberate. Each swallow was a statement. The lunch was made of sandpaper and betrayal. That evening, Sterling appeared in Marcus's room at 5:34 p.m. with Sergeant Major Webb still sitting vigil, and Katie stood against the far wall, hands clasped. She was a background instrument in his symphony. Sterling gestured dismissively in her direction while addressing the boy's father directly, his voice riding the frequency of false concern. Your son's nurse seems to think she knows better than 15 board-certified specialists. We call that type the unit hero, comes in thinking they'll save everyone, usually get someone killed. His eyes flicked toward Katie with the precision of a sniper target lasing. Poor judgment mixed with overconfidence. Dangerous combination in pediatric care. Katie didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't breathe differently. Pain was information, and she registered this the way she'd registered incoming mortar fire 15 years ago in Kandahar as data to be filed and processed. Her hands remained clasped at her midsection. Her face showed nothing because there was nothing to show. The tremor in her left hand, the one that came in the dark hours when nobody was watching, stayed locked down behind muscle memory. Sergeant Major Webb watched her not react to being verbally dismantled in front of his son. He was a man trained to read human behavior in high-stress situations, and what he saw in Katie Rodriguez was something the specialists didn't possess, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. That night, Katie began the unauthorized work in the hours when Sterling's empire of consultants had departed to their homes and their dinner tables. She entered Marcus's room at 9:14 p.m., the monitor glowing soft blue in darkness, and told the on-call resident she was checking his extremity sensation. She lifted the boy's left hand with fingers that had held lives together in field hospitals where the ceiling was open sky and the pharmacy was what you could carry in a pack. Specific pressure patterns. Precise angles. She'd learned this technique treating blast victims in the Helmand province where the formal rules of medicine were suggestions and improvisation meant the difference between a name on a memorial wall and a name in a senior officer's retirement speech. Her fingers worked the neural pathways that 15 specialists had written off as dead tissue, manipulating joints with the kind of technical precision that required zero formal credentialing. Sergeant Major Webb watched from the doorway on night 6 of this unauthorized protocol. Arms crossed. Skeptical. Desperate enough not to report her. On night 19, Marcus whispered "Dad" with a voice like wind through broken glass. On night 21, the boy's left index finger moved 1 full centimeter upward. Webb's face crumbled. Not dramatically. Quietly. The way a man cries when nobody's trained him how to hope. Katie documented the progress in the medical record with clinical precision. Patient demonstrates improved motor tone left upper extremity. Index finger extension against gravity. For sentences. Cold. Professional. Irrefutable. Sterling arrived at 7:23 a.m. the following morning holding a printed copy of her note, flanked by 2 hospital board members Katie had never seen before, their badges hanging like weapons. His voice cut through the morning quiet like a surgical blade through tissue. "This is falsified documentation," he announced to the charge nurse, loud enough that 4 other staff members froze mid-task. Wishful thinking from an overwhelmed nurse who can't accept reality. He filed a formal complaint with the Texas Board of Nursing that same day and made a phone call to Katie's nursing school, the call that would come back to haunt him because nobody on earth was expecting to discover that 5 years of absolutely pristine employment history was preceded by absolutely nothing, a gap so clean and precise that it could only mean one thing: someone powerful had erased it. But that wasn't the worst part. That evening, Katie's 16-year-old son Derek came home from school to find her standing in their garage staring at a locked shadow box. The box held things she forbade him to ever touch, things she kept in the dark corner beside the seasonal decorations and the boxes of her wedding dress that she never opened. When he asked what was wrong, she said something that would haunt him through high school and beyond, the words delivered with the tone of someone who'd already accepted defeat. "Some fights you can't win by fighting, Derek. Some you just lose quietly." She went inside without waiting for a response. The next morning, Sterling expanded his investigation with the precision of a military campaign. He called Hospital Administrator James Chen to flag Katie's suspicious background and demanded a full HR review. His tone suggested he'd discovered evidence of criminal conspiracy rather than a nurse who simply looked at a patient like he was a human being instead of a billable code. He ordered the night shift supervisor to restrict Katie's access to Marcus's room after 8 p.m., citing concerning boundary issues with the family in a memo that would later be described as both legally indefensible and absolutely devastating in its effectiveness. But Marcus kept improving. The sensation returned to his left hand in the hours Katie wasn't supposed to be touching him. Shoulder movement appeared like spring grass through concrete. The body was healing itself using techniques Dr. Sterling would never understand because Dr. Sterling had stopped looking at patients years ago. He'd started looking at billing codes, device commissions, and the architecture of his own professional reputation. The first unauthorized session happened at 11:08 p.m. on a Tuesday, when the hallway monitors cycled to their dimmest setting and the only sound was the ventilator's mechanical breathing in Marcus Webb's room. Katie entered through the service entrance, past the supply closet where she'd stashed a resistance band and a therapy ball she'd ordered using her own credit card, $127.43 charge before she could reconsider. The boy was awake, as she'd known he would be. Insomnia was another thing the specialists had catalogued and dismissed, common in pediatric spinal injury cases, managed with sedation. She didn't sedate him. Instead, she sat at the edge of his bed and said, "Marcus, we're going to try something different tonight. You're going to tell me if anything hurts, if anything feels strange, if you feel anything at all. You understand?" He nodded, and she saw it, that small flutter of hope that 15 doctors had extinguished in him. She began with the techniques she'd learned in combat field rehabilitation courses, protocols designed for soldiers whose spinal injuries came from shrapnel and blast trauma rather than diving accidents. The difference was subtle but absolute. These weren't exercises meant to accept paralysis. They were meant to awaken what still lived beneath it. She used proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation patterns, the kind she'd performed on team for medics during that 2004 deployment outside Kandahar's Paktika province. Cross-pattern movements. Diagonal spirals. Her hands, steady as a surgical laser, guided his limbs through movements his nervous system had forgotten were possible. She talked him through it, her voice low and measured. "Your body remembers. We're just reminding it. 20 minutes. 30. 45. His left shoulder showed the first real response, not a reflex but intentional contraction. She felt it beneath her palm and said nothing, because saying something would break the concentration, would make it real too soon, might jinx it with the weight of what it meant. She repeated the sessions every night for 2 weeks, always between 11:48 p.m. and 12:45 a.m., always in the darkest part of the shift when the ICU nurses were clustered around the medication station and Sterling's team had gone home to their houses with 3-car garages. The resistance band became her signature tool. She'd loop it around his wrist, apply tension, and guide him through bilateral movements. By day 7, Marcus's left hand twitched on command, not a spasm, not a reflex, but an instruction following a neural pathway that the neurologists had declared permanently severed. By day 14, his left thumb could oppose his fingers. Just barely. Just enough to change everything. Sergeant Major Webb watched from the visitor's chair most nights, exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, his uniform jacket folded neatly over the armrest. He never spoke during the sessions. He just watched his son's left hand move, and Katie saw something shift in his expression, the first moment since Marcus's accident where his face held something other than grief. She understood that look. She'd seen it on the faces of operators when they realized they weren't paralyzed, when they realized the damage was survivable, when they realized they might actually have a future. Documentation began on day 21. Katie knew it was risky, knew it created a paper trail, knew that Sterling would eventually see it. But leaving no record meant the progress would be attributed to spontaneous neurological recovery, would be dismissed as a coincidence, would vanish like so many small victories do when no one official writes them down. She used precise medical language in Marcus's chart. Patient demonstrates restored motor control in left upper extremity. Grade 3 strength in thumb opposition. Sensation intact to light touch across left hand and partial forearm. patient's own initiative and family participation in recovery protocol. She didn't mention the resistance band or the late-night sessions. She didn't mention the combat field rehabilitation techniques. She documented only what was observable, measurable, undeniable. The chart note was 4 lines. It contradicted everything Sterling had promised the family. It contradicted the 15 specialists' unanimous diagnosis. It contradicted the entire justification for a $40,000 device that was still scheduled for implantation. Sterling found it at 6:15 a.m. on day 22, when he pulled Marcus's chart during morning rounds. Katie was at the nursing station, preparing medications for her assigned patients, when she heard the sound of a chair scraping backward with enough force to send it spinning into a nearby desk. Then footsteps. Fast. Angry. His voice, who documented this recovery? Cold. Perfectly controlled. The kind of anger that had already calculated its next move. Katie turned. I did. It's observable progress, Dr. Sterling. Documented. You documented fiction. His jaw was tight, his voice like a tank engine idling in a garage, pressure building. This child has been on a locked spine protocol for 3 weeks. No therapy. No unauthorized interventions. That was the agreement with the family. With you, Katie said. Not with the family. He stepped closer. Close enough that she could smell the cologne, expensive, sharp, and something underneath it that smelled like fear. You're going to remove that documentation from the chart. Today. Before rounds. Or I will personally call your nursing school and ask them to explain your employment history. Do you understand what I'm asking? Katie felt the moment settle into her bones. She'd been in tense situations before, rooms filling with smoke, decisions being made in seconds that would determine who lived and who didn't, people yelling orders that contradicted other orders. This was different. This was calculation. This was the moment he recognized her as a threat and decided to treat her like one. She took one measured breath and met his eyes directly. No. Excuse me. I'm not removing documented progress. It's real. You can see it in the chart. I can show you the assessment findings. I can? You can stay in your lane or you won't have a lane to stay in. He turned away, and she heard him say it quietly, with absolute certainty, call the nursing school. Get me her transcript records. And find out who authorized her hiring with that employment gap. He was already walking toward the administrative offices, his phone already in his hand, his next call already being calculated. That afternoon, Sterling convened an emergency case conference. Katie learned about it from the respiratory therapist, Maya, a former Army medic who'd seen enough to recognize what was happening and brave enough to warn her. Conference room, 2 p.m., all 15 specialists, Sterling's presenting something about accelerated intervention. Maya's voice was low, urgent. He pulled the device company rep in. They're talking about moving the implant up to tomorrow morning instead of next week. What they didn't know was that Katie had already found Sterling's name in the device company's consultant agreement. She'd accessed it through the hospital's purchasing database, not hacking, just reading the documentation that was technically available if you knew where to look, and there it was. Dr. Marcus Sterling, clinical consultant, $3,500 quarterly retainer, plus $500 per successful implantation placed. The math was simple, 15 surgeries at $500 each meant $7,500 in commission. Marcus Webb's surgery alone was worth more than Sterling's monthly malpractice insurance. She printed the page and brought it to the charge nurse. We need to report this. The device company has a financial relationship with Sterling. He's recommending unnecessary intervention. Stay in your lane or you won't have a lane to stay in. The charge nurse didn't even look at the paperwork. She just repeated Sterling's threat like it had already become policy. I'm not saying anything. Neither should you. Go home. You're making this worse. But Katie wasn't going home. Not yet. The conference room was soundproof, windows frosted to privacy, but she stood in the hallway and listened to Sterling's voice carrying through the door, clear, persuasive, authoritative. The recent documentation of minor motor response is neurologically insignificant. Spinal reflexes are common in C or 3 complete transections. We're seeing false hope, and every day we delay definitive intervention, we're delaying his actual recovery pathway. A pause. Then, I recommend immediate spinal cord stimulator placement. The hardware will provide electrical stimulation to intact neural pathways below the lesion. This is standard of care for pediatric complete transection cases. She heard the device company representative, "We have an OR available tomorrow at 6 a.m. Full surgical team standing by." 3 of the 15 specialists voiced agreement. The other 12 said nothing, which meant they'd already been convinced, which meant it was over. The consent form was already being prepared. Sterling was already calling the Webbs. That night, Katie couldn't sleep. She sat in her apartment, the combat boots on the floor beside her, worn leather, scuffs from 100 operations, the sole separating where she'd run through the rubble in Kandahar pulling that infant from beneath concrete and rebar. 20 years ago. The child who was now 12 years old. The child who'd regained sensation in his left hand because she'd broken every protocol. Because she'd refused to accept that 15 experts with billing codes could be right when the patient's own nervous system was saying something different. She thought about what would happen if she filed a formal complaint against Sterling's device company relationship. She thought about the chain of command that would follow. The investigation. Sterling's friends in hospital administration. The way institutional power moves like water around obstacles. She thought about the infant in the rubble, about the promise she'd made in the dark, about all the ways she'd already failed this second chance. At 10:15 p.m., she stood in the hallway outside Marcus's room. He was still awake, his left hand resting on the blanket, and she watched it twitch involuntarily. She watched it move, watched him squeeze his eyes shut like he was trying to control it, trying to prove it was real. The nurse assigned to his room was charting at the station. The hallway was empty. She entered his room one last time as the nurse no one suspected. The monitor alarm screamed at 4:22 a.m. Katie was in the medication room when the code call echoed through the ICU speakers, a thin, desperate sound that made every nurse's chest tighten. Shift change. 2,300 hours when staff rotations created the gaps where bad things lived. She heard the running footsteps before the intercom crackled, code blue, pediatric ICU, Bay 4. Marcus's Bay. Her hand stopped moving. The medication cart forgotten. She knew the hospital's restriction order. Sterling had been explicit in the disciplinary write-up. Stay away from patient web or face immediate termination. But restriction orders didn't supersede the sound of a child's life ending, and Katie's body moved like it had been doing this for 20 years, because it had. She was moving before permission could catch up. The ICU bay was already chaos when she arrived, the organized kind that meant people were drowning in protocol. The night nurse, Dishon, stood frozen at the bedside, hands hovering, waiting for anesthesia to arrive to intubate. Marcus's oxygen saturation was dropping like a stone through water. 92. 88. 84. His lips had turned the color of old bruises. His eyes were rolling back, the whites showing, his small chest heaving against ribs that couldn't pull air anymore. The hiss of a failing respiratory system. Katie moved to the bedside with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done field triage under live fire. She didn't announce herself. She simply placed her left hand on Marcus's neck, fingers spread across the tracheal space, palpating. What she felt made her certain. The skin was swollen, not infection, barotrauma, air trapped in the tissues from undetected tracheal swelling. The kind of swelling that happened when a body tried to heal from trauma that 14 of Sterling's 15 specialists had somehow missed in their 5-minute chart reviews and their kickback consultations. The tension pneumothorax was collapsing the airway from the inside. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath. Her voice didn't sound like a nurse asking permission. It sounded like someone giving combat orders. Now. Dishon moved without thinking. The surgical technician at the foot of the bed moved. The resident froze and then moved. Katie's hands were already finding the landmark, the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, muscle memory overriding the 20 years since Kandahar. Her hands didn't shake. The tremor in her chest wasn't fear. It was restraint. The needle went in clean. The hiss of air escaping sounded like a held breath releasing. Marcus's chest expanded. Color flooded back into his face like someone was painting life back onto a canvas. His oxygen saturation climbed. 90. 94. 97. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. The child's body relaxed into the mattress, finally able to breathe. The entire emergency took 90 seconds. 6 witnesses stood in the bay. 6 people who had just watched Katie Rodriguez perform an unauthorized emergency decompression with the hand of someone who had done this before, not once, but hundreds of times, in places where anesthesia didn't arrive and permission didn't matter. Sergeant Major Webb stood in the corner, his jaw clenched, watching his son breathe. One of the residents was filming on his phone. Of course he was. Everything got filmed now. Katie documented exactly what she had done and why. No embellishment. No apology embedded in the narrative. Facts. Timestamp. Procedure. Outcome. She signed her name and her shift hours and walked back to the nursing station before anyone could think to stop her. Dr. Sterling arrived at 5:16 a.m. in his Tesla-branded polo shirt, looking like someone who had been called away from something more important than a child's life. His face when he saw the documentation was the face of a man whose kickback arrangement had just developed complications. You performed invasive medical procedures without physician oversight. Not a question. An accusation. I performed emergency airway management on a pediatric patient in acute distress. Katie's voice had shifted one register lower. Which is within the scope of emergency nursing care in life-threatening situations. You performed a medical procedure. You are a nurse, not a doctor. That is practicing medicine without a license, and you are terminated as of this moment. He turned to the charge nurse. Call security. I want her out of this building in 15 minutes. Sergeant Major Webb stepped forward. Dr. Sterling, my son was dying. She saved him. Whatever protocol she violated. Your son's care is complex and requires physician-level decision-making. Sterling's lawyer appeared in the doorway like he had been waiting outside. Of course he had. If you pursue any complaint about Ms. Rodriguez's termination, we will have to reconsider Oak Creek Memorial's ability to provide specialized care for Marcus's condition. I'm sure you understand how difficult it would be to transfer him to another facility at this stage of treatment. Not a threat. A calculation. Webb's shoulders tensed, but he didn't move. He understood the language. He was military. He knew what it meant when someone held a gun to your child's head and called it policy. Security came at 7:15 a.m. 2 men in dark polo shirts who looked at Katie the way people looked at Contagion. She gathered her things from the locker, her name badge, her pen with the broken clip, the pair of worn combat boots that didn't belong in a hospital but had never belonged anywhere else either. The boots went into a plastic bag. Everything fit into what you could carry in 2 hands. Dishon wouldn't meet her eyes when she passed the nursing station. Neither would the resident with the phone. Nobody moved. That was the strange part about being erased. Nobody wanted to catch the disease of knowing you. The rain came that evening in sheets, the kind that moved horizontally through Houston's late August humidity like bullets finding flesh. Katie stood in front of the grave marker in Houston National Cemetery at 8:08 p.m., mud soaking through her shoes, her scrubs still damp from the rain. The grave had no body in it. Michael Rodriguez had been buried in Arlington with full honors 18 years ago, but this was where she came when she needed to be close to someone who understood the weight of not being able to stay buried. She collapsed to her knees on the muddy grass. I couldn't stay hidden. Her voice was barely audible over the storm. I couldn't keep my head down. I couldn't let that boy die with the doctors telling him it was over. And now he's going to die anyway, because I failed you again, and I'll keep failing because I can't stop being what I am, and what I am got you killed and now it's killing him. The rain hammered down like artillery fire in the distance, like the world was punishing her for being careless enough to care. The plastic bag with the boot sat on the passenger seat of her car, 20 meters away. Those boots had walked through Kandahar. They had walked through 20 years of hiding. They had walked out of Oak Creek Memorial Hospital in disgrace at 7:15 a.m. She didn't cry. Senior chief petty officers didn't cry in the rain at their husband's grave when they had failed their second rescue in 20 years. They just knelt there in the mud and understood the mathematics of loss: one boy saved, one career ended, one secret finally exposed to the light. What she didn't know yet was that those secrets were about to walk back in, and this time they would be wearing a Navy dress uniform and carrying the weight of classified operations that had been buried so deep that only the Pentagon knew where the bodies were hidden. Sergeant Major Webb's phone was already ringing. His son was awake now, breathing, alive because of something Katie had done. And Webb remembered something from Kandahar that he had never told anyone. He remembered an infant pulled from rubble by a soldier with steady hands and a face he had never forgotten. The next morning would begin not with Katie's disgrace, but with the arrival of people who knew exactly who she was and exactly what she had done. But tonight, she just knelt in the rain with the mud soaking through her shoes, whispering apologies to a dead husband and a living boy and the person she used to be before she tried to save anyone at all. Dr. Sterling's hands shook as he pulled up the hospital security system. 4:37 in the afternoon. The conference room had ended 10 minutes ago, the board members already filing their preliminary reports, already calculating their legal exposure. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the precision of someone erasing a life. 3 months of footage. Security camera feeds from the parking garage level 3, where the device company representatives met him every other Thursday. The envelope exchanges. The conversations about patient referral arrangements and consultation fees for specialists who spent 5 minutes reviewing charts and the rest of the time depositing checks. He clicked through folders. Delete. 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 His breathing came in short bursts, not the measured calm of a man in control but the gasping panic of a man watching his future burn in real time. 23 years at Oak Creek Memorial. Chief of Neurology. Board certification. Prestige. All of it evaporating like rain on hot asphalt. The computer screen glowed with the cold light of his own destruction. He was thorough, he had to be thorough. Every frame that showed his face, every timestamp that could be cross-referenced with his bank deposits, every conversation about which patient's military insurance would cover the most expensive equipment. He didn't notice the alert that appeared on his screen. A small notification in the corner, barely visible. Backup initiated. The hospital's automatic security protocol. Every deletion automatically triggered a redundancy backup to an off-site federal server. It was a standard IT protocol. Probably. He wasn't thinking about protocols. He was thinking about his wife. She'd called an hour ago. The way her voice sounded, not angry but empty, the sound of someone who'd already mentally divided the house and the savings account and decided he wasn't worth the fight anymore. 2 floors below, in the IT department, Chen sat at his workstation with 3 monitors arranged in a semicircle. The hospital systems administrator. Marine Corps veteran. 51 years old. Had served under Sergeant Major Webb in Fallujah during the surge, back when they were both young enough to believe they were invincible. Webb had called him 3 weeks ago. Not with threats, just with a request: keep an eye on Sterling. Quietly. That's all. Chen didn't ask why. He'd been watching Sterling's network activity for 15 days when he noticed the pattern. Unusual access to security feeds. Multiple downloads. The signature of someone covering tracks. Chen had already been saving copies. Each frame Sterling deleted appeared on Chen's secondary monitor, a ghost image of evidence the moment before it vanished from the primary system. He'd been documenting for 2 weeks, building a timeline, cross-referencing Sterling's office calendar with the device company meetings, comparing the dates to Sterling's bank deposit history. The CMS fraud hotline had a direct number. Chen had it written on a post-it note beneath his monitor. He picked up his desk phone and dialed. Federal investigator answering, a woman's voice said. "My name is Marcus Chen. I'm calling to report ongoing Medicare fraud at Oak Creek Memorial Hospital in Houston, Texas. And I have the evidence." He spoke with the precision of someone describing a combat operation. "I'm watching my supervisor delete it right now. His name is Dr. James Sterling, Chief of Neurology. He's been taking payments from medical device companies in exchange for unnecessary surgical recommendations. 90 minutes. That's all the time between Chen's call and the moment two federal investigators in dark suits walked into Sterling's office with a warrant. They didn't knock. Sterling was still at his computer, his fingers still moving across the keyboard, when the older of the two placed his hand on Sterling's shoulder and said 4 words, "Step away from the terminal." Sterling's face went the color of wet plaster. The kind of pale that comes from a man understanding, in a single moment, that he was no longer in control of his own narrative. One investigator took possession of the computer while the other read Sterling his rights, the words washing over him like a wave he couldn't breathe through. The hard copy of the warrant stayed on his desk. The language was clinical. The numbers were precise. $340,000. Quarterly payments. 2 years. 3 separate medical device companies. Conspiracy to defraud Medicare? Conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Conspiracy to commit money laundering. The hospital board convened an emergency session at 4 o'clock that same evening. Emergency. The word carried weight. Chen saved footage played on the conference room television screen. Sterling in the parking garage, his coat collar turned up against the cold. A woman handing him an envelope. The two of them talking, heads close together, Sterling's body language casual, comfortable, the posture of a man who believed his actions were so routine they barely qualified as noteworthy. More footage. Different dates. The same woman. Different envelopes. Then came the audio. Chen had saved that too. Sterling's voice, tinny and precise through the hospital's parking garage microphone system. "If you run the spinal stimulator on the web, kid, you're looking at 40 grand minimum. Insurance will cover it. Kids are paraplegic, families military, they won't question the recommendation when it comes from 15 different doctors." A pause. The woman's voice, "An hour end. 10% finder's fee. That's standard. This one should be easy. Single father, traumatized, desperate for any option." The silence in the boardroom after that audio finished was the kind of silence that precedes cascades. One board member stood up and walked out without speaking. Another rubbed his face with both hands. The board chair, a man who'd known Sterling for 12 years, looked at him with an expression that suggested he was looking at a stranger wearing his colleague's clothes. The 15 specialists on Marcus Webb's case were suspended pending investigation within 2 hours. Their names went into a federal database. Their individual practices began receiving calls from compliance officers. The FBI seized Sterling's financial records and found something even worse than the initial investigation suggested: kickback arrangements with 4 other device companies, not 3. 5 years, not 2. Over $600,000 in payments. Sterling had been corrupt for longer and more comprehensively than anyone initially believed. The Texas Medical Board opened a formal investigation. Sterling's attorney, a woman who probably billed $300 an hour and who looked at him across her desk with the expression of someone calculating whether defending him was worth the reputational damage, advised immediate surrender. "Your medical license," she said, "is already gone. The question is whether you negotiate to avoid prison time." Sterling signed the surrender agreement on a Thursday morning. His license was revoked immediately. No appeals process. No provisional status. The language was final, permanently prohibited from practicing medicine in the state of Texas. His wife hired a divorce attorney that same afternoon. Security footage captured her leaving their home with 3 suitcases. She didn't look back at the house. She didn't look at Sterling, who stood in the driveway watching her drive away. Just kept moving forward, the kind of movement that suggests a decision already made and finalized in the seconds before the cameras caught the image. The hospital board voted to terminate Sterling's employment that evening. The vote was unanimous. By the next morning, his face was on every Houston news station. Local neurosurgeon charged with Medicare fraud. Doctor allegedly ordered unnecessary surgery for kickback payments. Federal investigation reveals multi-year device company conspiracy. The headlines had a weight to them, a finality. This wasn't a private matter anymore. This was public destruction of the methodical, systemic kind. 6 months later, something different happened. Something that didn't make the news because it was too quiet, too personal, too much like what actual heroism looks like when nobody's recording. Marcus Webb walked across his middle school gymnasium with leg braces and a cane. The braces were aluminum and black, professional medical equipment, and they clicked against the polished floor with each step. His left hand gripped the cane with the focused intensity of someone learning to trust their own body again. His right hand was free. He was holding the Principal's Award for Courage, a plaque with his name engraved on it, the weight of the award genuine and earned. His father stood in the front row. Sergeant Major David Webb. Dress blues. Dress blues meant formal military recognition. Dress blues meant he wasn't just attending as a parent, he was there as an officer. As a Marine. As a man who had fought in 3 countries and who was fighting now for his son in the only way fathers know how, by being present. By witnessing. By standing at attention. By saluting his child as the boy crossed the stage, his pace uneven but purposeful, his face focused on the distance between himself and the end of the stage. Tears came down Sergeant Major Webb's face the moment Marcus reached the podium. Not sobs. Marines don't sob in public. Just the silent overflow of 18 months of despair transforming into something else. Hope. Pride. Recognition. His right hand came up in salute, the motion crisp and precise, the gesture ancient and formal. His son looked toward him and nodded. That single nod contained everything. I am here. I am alive. I am walking. The gymnasium erupted. Parents stood. Teachers clapped. Marcus's former physical therapist, a girl his own age from the hospital's rehabilitation wing, stood in the bleachers and waved. And somewhere in that gymnasium, in the space between the applause and the moment, was the invisible presence of a woman in navy dress blues, standing somewhere she couldn't be seen, carrying the satisfaction that comes from saving a life and never asking for recognition. Because that same morning, 2,000 miles away in Arlington, Virginia, Katie Rodriguez was standing in a Pentagon corridor in her navy dress uniform. Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Marie Rodriguez. The rank was embroidered on her collar. The uniform was the deep blue of the Naval Special Warfare Command, not the Medical Corps. The Secretary of Defense stood before her with a small box containing a rank pin, the senior chief insignia, an anchor and 3 chevrons, the symbol of authority that takes 20 years to earn and 60 seconds to pin. Her son Derek stood beside her, 16 years old, wearing a suit that was slightly too large for him because he'd grown 3 inches in the past 8 months and clothes were an afterthought when your mother had been erased from history and was now about to be restored. He was holding something. The worn combat boots. The ones Katie had kept in her locker at Oak Creek Memorial. The leather was creased and faded from 2 decades of service, 2 different wars, 2 different countries, 2 different identities that were now being merged back into a single timeline. The Secretary of Defense read the citation. Her voice was measured and formal, the voice of institutional recognition acknowledging what classified ops required to be hidden. Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Marie Rodriguez served with distinction in 14 combat operations across Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Central Asia. She disrupted a human trafficking network in Kandahar province, recovering 37 individuals and providing intelligence that dismantled a regional trafficking hub. For her actions under fire, she received the Navy Cross. For her leadership under impossible conditions, she received 2 Silver Stars and a Bronze Star with Valor. For her sacrifice, she received a Purple Heart. And for her integrity, she was placed in witness protection, her identity classified, her service erased from public record to protect her family's safety. The citation continued. 14 classified operations. 3 combat zones. 23 years of service. 37 lives recovered. An estimated 4,847 lives saved indirectly through disrupted intelligence networks, closed trafficking routes, and dismantled criminal infrastructure. The numbers were precise. The weight of them was considerable. The Secretary of Defense pinned the senior chief insignia on Katie's uniform. The motion was ceremonial and final. The rank was no longer provisional. Katie's hands didn't shake. Her face showed no emotion. The composure of someone who had already survived the worst and had learned that recognition doesn't change anything. The work was always the point, never the applause. Sergeant Major Webb sat in the audience with Marcus beside him. When the Secretary of Defense finished and stepped back, Webb stood. The motion was subtle, just a standing ovation that began with a single man in dress blues, but it spread through the room like a wave. Officers stood. Military personnel stood. Family members stood. The gymnasium, because it was in a gymnasium, because the Pentagon held small ceremonies in temporary spaces, filled with the sound of hands coming together. Katie looked out into the applause and saw Webb's face. He wasn't clapping. He was saluting. The motion brought her back to something she'd forgotten she'd been carrying, the boy she'd pulled from rubble in Kandahar, the child she'd held, the responsibility that had never actually ended. It had just changed shape. From combat to medicine. From classified operations to midnight physical therapy sessions in a hospital where everyone believed she was just a nurse. Derek squeezed her hand. The only person in that moment who could touch her without breaking the military protocol of the ceremony. Her son. The bridge between her 2 lives. He lifted the boot slightly, catching the light. Katie nodded. Not permission. Acknowledgement. The boots had carried her through 2 wars and 2 identities. They had carried her to Kandahar and to Houston and to this moment where the uniform finally matched the truth again. The reception afterward was brief. Military protocol. Photographs. Handshakes. A brigadier general told her that the Navy Special Warfare Command was reopening her service file for full archival review and that her unit would be receiving a commendation for the Kandahar op once the declassification process completed, probably within 18 months. Another officer, a Navy captain, asked if she'd consider consulting on a new trauma medicine curriculum being developed for combat field personnel. Katie said she would think about it. The non-answer of someone still learning how to say yes to things again. But the moment that mattered came at the end of the ceremony, when Sergeant Major Webb approached her with Marcus beside him. The boy was standing without the cane. The braces were hidden beneath his dress pants. He was thinner than he should have been. 18 months of rehabilitation does that to a 12-year-old, but his eyes were clear. Alive. Webb extended his hand for a handshake, but Katie extended hers and his hand closed around it instead, the grip brief and strong. No words. Just the recognition of 2 soldiers who understood that rescue comes in different forms and that saving a life was never really about the moment of rescue itself. It was about showing up afterward. It was about the unglamorous work of rehabilitation. It was about being willing to lose your career, your reputation, your identity, because a child needed help and you were the only one who could provide it. You kept your promise, Webb said. Just those 5 words. You brought my son home twice. Katie saluted him. The motion was precise and formal and absolute. Then she looked down at Marcus and said something that would have been impossible to say 6 months ago, when she was still erased. Your father is right. You came back. That was the hard part. Everything else was just showing up. They stood together for the photographs that would go into military archives, documents of recognition, proof that the work had mattered. Katie Rodriguez in her full senior chief dress uniform. Derek beside her holding the worn combat boots. Sergeant Major Webb with his arm around his son. The image looked like redemption, but it felt like accountability. The distinction mattered. Back at Oak Creek Memorial, Katie Rodriguez stood in her full Navy dress uniform in the pediatric rehabilitation ward. The uniform drew looks. Patients whispered. Other nurses asked about the medals, about the insignia, about who this woman actually was. Katie placed the pair of worn combat boots back in her locker, on the shelf where they'd always belonged. She locked the door and hung the key on a lanyard around her neck. A young nurse, brand new, fresh out of nursing school, still terrified of doing everything wrong, asked her about the boots. "What's the story there, Katie?" Katie looked at the boots through the small locker window and said quietly, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." She didn't explain further. Some stories require the person listening to already understand the work that lives in silence. But then something shifted. Katie Rodriguez, Senior Chief Petty Officer, was appointed to lead a new program. Combat Trauma Rehabilitation for Veteran Nurses. The hospital board, chastened by the fraud investigation and desperate for positive press, gave her complete authority. No oversight. No committee approval necessary. The mandate was simple: figure out how to help military nurses who'd witnessed trauma recognize their own trauma and heal from it. Katie hired 3 other veteran nurses, 2 from the Army, 1 from the Air Force. She designed a curriculum based on field medicine principles, on the recognition that trauma isn't weakness, it's information. Pain is data. Marcus Webb attended physical therapy at Oak Creek Memorial 3 times a week. The progress was gradual and then accelerating. 6 weeks in, he walked from the reception desk to the physical therapy wing without the cane. His father watched from the waiting area, papers spread across his lap, paperwork for the lawsuit against Dr. Sterling, against the hospital, against the device companies. The settlements would be significant. Military families deserved that recognition. Katie was there for Marcus's first independent steps, the moment when the therapist let go and the boy walked without assistance for the first time in 18 months. The distance was short, maybe 20 feet, but it was a distance he covered entirely on his own. No cane. No braces. Just the focused concentration of a child understanding that his body was his again. At the end of those 20 feet, Katie was waiting. The same hands that had pulled him from rubble in Kandahar. The same hands that had performed the needle decompression that saved his life in a Houston hospital. Now those hands steadied him as he stepped forward into whatever came next. Marcus looked up at her and asked the question that Katie had been waiting for someone to ask: "Who were you before you were a nurse?" Katie considered the truth, the complete, classified, impossible truth, and decided that the abbreviated version was sufficient. "Someone who knew how to save people," she said. "And I still do." If you haven't already, please subscribe and like for more stories about the heroes walking among us, the ones nobody knows about, the ones who show up when it matters and never ask for recognition. And let me know in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?